History, episode 126. Wednesday night. Gary, what's going on?
Oh, we have a very special guest tonight,
Who's joining us?
our Samuel Roche. So we're going to refer to him as Sam because we're already fast friends. But allow me to introduce him, and then we'll get into really why he's both such a fascinating person and guest, and we're very honored and privileged to have him on. So, I'm Samuel Roche, hails from Savannah, Georgia. Like John Calhoun, he's a Southern gentleman who ventured off to Yale for studies. There, he received his master's in architecture, and that was after his undergrad years and studies at Princeton. Another Southerner went there, but and later became chancellor of the university, but we won't mention him, Woodrow Wilson. He is the son. He is now working as an architect with what is the name of the firm, Sam?
Stevenson Roche.
Stevenson Broche. And the former firm that I have down from the book here,
It was Hammond, Beebe, Rupert, Ainge, which became HBRA.
HBRA, yes. And they were the firm who worked on the Harold Washington Library here?
Yes, among
Wonderful.
other buildings.
Okay, excellent. Yeah, among other buildings, I'm sure. Though in New York City now, it was his time in Chicago where he lived and worked, in which he got acquainted with the city, its life, its history, and especially its architecture. This led him to write this marvelous and fantastic book, which will be the center of our conversation today. And I was quite happy to receive as a gift as Sam came back to his once home just about a month and a half ago here in Chicago, and we were able to have a time where he accompanied us to mass, and then we had a nice Mexican lunch at a nice local restaurant, the Martinez restaurant in Bridgeport, if anyone's hungry. And we'll be speaking a lot about his rich understanding about the various plans, architectural, urban planning wise, as they developed within Chicago, particularly Burnham's plan of 1909 and its application here, how it was applied and successfully, and what is missing. And as Sam concludes in his book, and we'll actually quote from the conclusion here in a moment, that there were successes and failures here, and we'd like to talk and touch upon those as they were implemented in Chicago. So our Samuel Roche. Sam, welcome.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you. So let's start out with that conclusion. Your opening paragraph in the conclusion of the book. By the way, we should give props to your co-author. Could you talk about him a little bit?
Yeah, before we go really into the book, I would like to mention that I am in fact a co-author of this book. There were two of us.
Yes.
Eric Lasher was my co-author, and Eric Hammond, Beebe, Rupert, Ainge was started by Tom Beebe, and I think Jim Hammond was his name. And Tom Beebe was my professor in grad school at Yale, and he was the former dean of Yale. Tom designed Harold Washington Library. He designed the Rice Building at the Art Institute. He designed the Harris Theater. Tom probably retired maybe shortly after the book was written. He retired in maybe 2010. The book is 2009, 2010. And Eric succeeded him as the head of design of the firm. And then under Eric's leadership, the firm designed, Eric designed, let's see, in Chicago, the Salt Shed very recently is his work. University buildings for University of Virginia and University of Arkansas, buildings at Notre Dame, still in the sort of Chicago region. So Eric was both a great designer and a great draftsman. He designed and drew the proposed drawings for the plan that we proposed together that are in the book. So the book has very many of his original drawings. So we collaborated on the book, and then he did the illustrations, the original illustrations. And I have to say that it's interesting to be giving this, to be talking with you all this week and now, because Eric has just passed away last week after about about 5 years with ALS.
Oh, wow.
And
Okay.
so he he's sorely missed already.
I'm sure. Well, I'm glad that we could pay tribute to him and his work and contributions here. Um, what was it like working with him?
It was a very it, I'll just say generally, about to give context for our working together, the whole thing was a rather special occasion that I think is hard to perhaps it's unusual in architectural practices in general. Um, we were able, so the book was written as a sort of tribute to and analysis of the Burnham plan of 1909. And so it was published on the centennial of that plan,
Hmm.
right? And so we wanted to consider, well, how had that plan fared? What were the responses and sort of competitors of that plan? How had planning in general changed since that plan was proposed? How had it changed in Chicago? The big answer is, what was the impact of modernism on the kind of planning that Daniel Burnham and Edward Bennett proposed? And then we also wanted to sort of critique those different plans and see how they might inform a plan that we could make now.
Hmm.
So really, we wanted to use the Burnham plan as a point of departure for making a new plan, right? That would try to address
Yeah.
some of the shortcomings of that plan, right? And
Excellent.
I just want to add one quick thing, is that I would describe it as a very Chicago enterprise,
Hmm.
because Tom Beebe and Hammond Beebe Rupert Ainge were very much sort of that's a Chicago institution, that firm, having designed very many of the important public buildings built in Chicago in the last quarter of the 20th century, beginning of the 21st century. And the
Excellent.
book was supported from the very beginning by a man named Richard Driehaus, who was a big supporter of architecture in general and traditional architecture in particular. And so he agreed to support the preparation of the book, and the firm agreed to pay my salary to help prepare the book, and then we solicited subscriptions for the book, and that was how it was published.
Wonderful. So, of the firms, maybe the handful of firms that continue to work and ply the trade of architecture still in Chicago, is it your former firm, Skidmore, Owings and Merrill, that are still operative? Who would be the top three or four that you would cite?
Well, you'll always have the big corporate firms.
Hmm.
Gosh, in Chicago, Gensler, SOM, Jeannie Gang is sort of the what would I call her? Artist architect,
Okay.
celebrity architect.
Is she
Um,
the one that does the water type effacements?
yeah,
Okay.
her new building in Chicago is the one in. It's on the Chicago River,
Yes.
almost where it goes into the lake.
Mm-hmm.
Right, it goes
Right.
in and out like this as it goes up.
Right. Yeah, to reflect the waves or ripples of the waters, stuff.
Perhaps,
Yeah,
yes.
that's the idea, I guess. Uh-huh.
I would say about about Hammond Beebe Rupert Ainge and Tom's firm is that it was always small and it was institutional. They did some commercial work. Um, Gosh, they had a long history before I was ever there. Uh, but I would describe them almost as a boutique institutional firm specializing in campus buildings, places with sort of complex physical and institutional and historical character. And Tom himself was a scholar of Mies van der Rohe, as well as being interested in traditional architecture. So I think he really sort of strode the line between um, what's classical and what's modern in a very Chicago way. Chicago
Very
has
much so.
there's a particular reason I think that can happen in Chicago.
Mm. Well, speaking about that reason, I'll let you elaborate in a moment, but I see in the probably his most famous work within Chicago, the Harold Washington Library,
Yes.
echoes and refrains of that there's a combination of the classical and the more modern and concerns about function are there, and yet there are these, let's call them classical flourishes, particularly
Yeah.
on the exterior of the building. Could you elaborate on that?
Well, I think we'd have to describe it. Does it seem more like a classical building or a modern building to you all?
Boy, I classically modern.
Yeah,
Talking
yeah,
about being on the
or
fence there.
modernly classic,
Modernly classical,
you know.
sure.
But it looks like a civic building, right? It looks like what it is. Gosh, I don't know what else it might look like than a big library. Maybe
Or an opera house.
or an opera house. Yeah, opera house would be good. Yes,
Mhm.
it could be an opera house, maybe.
Mhm.
It's got an air of fantasy to it that I think an opera house could also have, and it's sort of super scale like an opera house would be. Um, you know, I would call it a kind of very solid looking. You can't really tell when it's from. I mean, I guess I guess it's technically postmodern, but I think to someone who doesn't know architecture, it looks like it's much older,
Mm, yes.
right? And yet there's something about it that um, I think it's dated. I think it has worn very well. I think it still looks good. It still looks like a big public building in a big city.
Yes, I would agree. I definitely agree. So I'll go. Can I dive into the conclusion now?
Please.
Okay, wonderful. It's so well written, also. So you write, along with Eric, that most American cities share Chicago's grid-based plan and radial arrangement of district zones, as well as the historical patterns of development that produce these features. Chicago's geographic character and its transportation-based economy have exaggerated and simplified these spatial and historical patterns, so that the city is developed as a kind of laboratory for plans that propose to improve on them. Together, these plans, beneficiaries of a local tradition of practically minded architectural innovation, comprise a point of departure for investigating the persistent and evolving planning issues that confront the American city more generally. And reading through the book, I really appreciated that that is a theme that unifies most of the work both of you did, namely confronting this interesting challenge of the American city in the context of urban planning that had mostly been carried out in locales like Vienna or Berlin or Bucharest or especially Paris,
Yes.
where there were spatial, historical, architectural, geographical limitations, and yet in the sprawling metropolises of the West and particularly Chicago, you didn't have such limitations, or it seemed as though the spatial limitations simply weren't present. And
Right.
that had an immense impact, not just on the plans, but to the edifices that would go up to characterize the city.
Yeah.
So what I that point that you had made previously about when you were talking about the evolution of how the book came to be, of the strain between the classical and the modern, uh, almost forming a type of healthy conflict that was reflected in the architecture. So go ahead and riff on that for a little while, Sam, if you would.
Well, um, why did let's just speaking specifically of the Burnham plan, why did classical architecture, why did it use classical architecture? Why was its language classical? And I think we should remember that at the time that the plan was proposed and began to be implemented, that particular style of classical architecture, which I would call Beaux-Arts classicism,
Mhm.
Beaux-Arts, the beautiful arts, the fine arts, that's the French academic tradition, wherein painting, sculpture, architecture are all joined together in one environment, in one composition.
And the goal is to not make it look cacophonous, but harmonious.
Yes,
The integration of
harmoniously
all
joined
of those
together.
things,
Yes,
even down to landscaping, like Olmsted's plans.
that's right. That's
Okay.
right. Um, well, it's exactly that was modern at the time of the plan, right?
Mhm.
So the classical was modern. And in fact, when the World's Columbian Exposition was planned and implemented, that represented really the leading edge of the field, right? And the plan of Chicago, basically the plan of Chicago proposed to make real some things that were proposed as fantasy, let's call it, in the World's Columbian Exposition. And so why this style? And I think it applies equally to both the exposition and the city itself, because it represented what they wanted the American cities to become. They wanted them to compete with and ultimately probably outdo their European counterparts. And they probably wanted, I suspect they wanted them to speak that language, that architectural language, even better than their predecessors had, and on a grander scale and on a bigger scale. And when you had a situation, as you did in Chicago and many American cities, where they were growing so rapidly on a scale that really was not comparable, I think, gosh, in 1893, Chicago was already the second largest city. It surpassed Philadelphia, I think, in the late 1880s or something.
I believe, yeah, I think it was actually just in late 1880s, or it might have been the year in which the city was. For some reason, I'm recalling Larson's book, The Devil Light City. I believe it might have been just that very year in which Chicago was awarded the exposition.
Oh, right. So 1890 then. I think
Yes.
I think around. And then and Chicago had been hardly anything 50 years before that.
Right.
And meanwhile, in Europe, I think the only bigger cities there, I was just reading them. They're somewhere in the book, but it's like Paris, Berlin, Vienna,
London,
and Naples, something like that. And so I think they had reason to think that Chicago would just keep going, and probably be the major metropolis. We could talk a little bit about why they thought that, why that was possible or plausible. But I think they were looking for a style that would unify something as disparate as Chicago was, which it had a very dense center and a very open and expansive periphery. And I'd say the thing that distinguishes American cities from their European counterparts, and probably has from the beginning, is that to the extent that we are able, we suburbanize. And so always you had people living on the periphery, working in the center. That happened at the very beginning in Chicago.
Yes.
And so always the American city was a spatially complex phenomenon, right? It was sort of zoned from the beginning. So you needed a style that would unify all of these things. And that style really had two parts. I think we described the real heart of the plan, the real sort of central element of the plan is this connective, enriched and beautified system of circulation. And really that exists more. I mean, it's the link between the periphery and the center. And so it has an architectural aspect, and then it has a landscape aspect, right? So it dovetails very nicely with sort of naturalistic ideas of landscape planning, Arcadian ideas as put forward by Olmsted.
Right.
And that too, going back to the World's Columbian Exposition, which really had two parts. It was overlaid on a plan on Jackson Park, which Olmsted had already designed in the Arcadian style. And really there was the Court of Honor, which was like a model central city. And then right next to it was an island in the middle of a lagoon with all the cultural buildings around it that was kind of an idealized Arcadian landscape. And I would call it an idealized periphery. Right. So from the very beginning, from the World's Columbian Exposition, you had this idea of center and periphery linked by this kind of classically ornamented landscape.
The elements, therefore, that were most outstandingly and most evidently implemented from Burnham's plan. Tell us about those, and did they accomplish, as they were implemented, that linkage between the center and the periphery?
I think the great success of the plan is basically its synthesis of earlier plans for parts of the city and the way that the city had developed naturally. And because that is its success, it becomes hard to distinguish and pick apart and pick out the aspects of the city that it that can be solely attributed to it. The plan itself capitalized on reality, on real conditions. So the open lakefront had already, Chicago started with 3 public park systems, a north, a west, and a south. And they were all designed to lure residential development, right? So the way they would do it is they would, I think ultimately they were state grants, but basically they would set aside landscape or they'd set aside land for development as parks, and then they would sell they'd sell lots around the edges of the park to developers who would then subdivide them, or blocks, and they would subdivide them into lots. And so it was all built on speculation, basically. And so what you had in Chicago is you had competition from the very beginning, because the north side was competing with the west side, was competing with the south side for, the best parks and thereby the best residents, right? And so Olmsted was hired by the South Park Commission to do these
Right.
2 parks, one on the lake and one inland. William LeBaron Jenney, who's credited with the home insurance building, the first steel frame or metal frame skyscraper, tall building, designed the West Park system, 3 parks there. What are they? Garfield, Humboldt, Douglas? Columbus is later.
Oh, it's like Columbus is later.
Columbus
Okay.
is in it, is Jens Jensen, and he's in the next generation after the plan of Chicago.
Okay.
I can't remember who the architect for the North system was, but it doesn't matter. Basically, you had these competitive parks that were then all welded together into one system by the plan, but they were by the plan of Chicago, but they were there to be welded already, right? And I would say that what the plan of Chicago did, is it enshrined these ideas and these actualities and sort of made them sacrosanct, so that they wouldn't be undone and they could gradually be improved. So even Grant Park, which is the centerpiece of the plan, it looked nothing like that when the plan was made. A lot of railroad tracks that are now under the park, and covered that serve the metro station there, were, they took up a lot of the park.
Yeah. Well, I find a lot of similarities as you were speaking of the park systems and how they integrated them eventually into the plan, but there was a almost healthy competition going through the park system. It's almost directly analogous, almost identical to the way in which the elevated train systems operated. That eventually, although they developed with particular customer bases in mind, and they were essentially private enterprises, they were eventually all melded together to function as an integral artery or series of arteries for the conduct of transport throughout the city.
Yeah, it's almost like the loop, by which I mean the tracks, comes at the end to unite them all and make them part of one system after the spokes all exist already.
Well said.
I'm not sure if that is how it happened, but I think it may be. I think those 4 sides may have been. I'm not quite positive, but yes, it's analogous to the way the L developed.
Sure. Charlie, did you want to?
Competition, then consolidation.
Yeah. Charlie, any questions you might have here?
I've got some way more general questions. I'm curious what your favorite piece of architecture in the city is.
In Chicago.
The Harold Washington Library. Didn't you hear him before?
It is a favorite. I have, these things change as we age. I tend to like different things at different times in my life. I've always loved very much, though, and probably I still do love, the kind of 20s classicism in Chicago. It's just very sophisticated, urbane, simple, clear, and direct, as Chicago's architecture always has been. And so what are the great examples of that? The Carbide and Carbon building, which is now, I think, the Hard Rock Hotel. It's kind of black, looks like a champagne bottle.
Yes.
I love that building.
The Jewelers building.
What's that?
The jeweler's building? You
Yes,
still
but maybe it's not quite as yes, it's a fine building. I think it's like a little bit wedding cake. Why is the
it's a
champagne
green
bottle better than
wedding
a
cake,
wedding
yeah.
cake? I don't know. Um, I think the Shed Aquarium is a very fine building. Is a very it, it's sort of the it's got to be one of the most elaborate classical buildings. I mean, it's been redone inside a bit, but full of ornamentation that evokes ocean life, in the classical language, and just very consummately done. There's something. The Field Museum is a very fine building, also. The I love the Great Monumental. Oh, I love the Elks Memorial, which is on Diversey and top of Lincoln Park. That's a very fine building.
Well, Sam, the Shed Aquarium always reminds me of something that could easily be Neptune's Acropolis.
Yeah, totally. That's
Yeah.
right.
It's
That's right.
almost as if a trident should be coming out of it.
Yes, absolutely. You know,
Yeah.
this aspect of fantasy that these buildings have, the great public buildings have, I think that is a crucial aspect for public buildings. I think that one of the great achievements of the Harold Washington Library is that it has that air of fantasy to it. How many buildings built in the past 40 years have that? I think it's largely gone. I mean, you can be told that the curves or the color of the glass of the new very tall skyscraper evoke the water, and I guess once you're told that, you can see it. But
Yeah.
you could almost walk into the Shed building not knowing what that building was, and no one would tell you, and you could guess what it was.
True. Yeah.
Why is architecture important to a society? Why does it matter?
I think, like every art, it's a reflection of the society that built it. And by virtue of its expense, its scale, it's sort of the most representative of the arts with regard to that reflection of society. So, why is it important? More than it, because we all see it every day, and because it's so public in its nature, and because it surrounds us. And I think also we have to distinguish architecture from building, because really buildings are what surround us and what we see every day. Architecture is a particular kind of building. It's the top of the building art, right? It's the art of building. But I think because it's so present for us, it represents the society to itself, right? So it's what what do we all see of Chicago every day? Well, we see what it looks like, right? And the image of the city is to a great extent the city itself. We live in the image, right? So it's through architecture that we perceive that image, critique it, try to improve it, inhabit old ones that other people made and that we can't live up to, right?
Is architecture the foremost form of art by which we try to make permanent our aspirations, what we'd like to see as permanent?
It all depends. When you use a word like permanent, I mean, I tend to think of all the arts as doing similar things. They're basically representing ideals or aspirations, at least until their modern incarnation. But really, that's a sort of footnote to what they are. That is what they are. They are representations of ideals. So, what's like when I think of Rome, a great ancient civilization, how do we remember it? Well, I think we'd have to say we remember it as much through its written accounts of it as we do its physical remains. So when we say permanent, literature can be pretty permanent, right? We all know Tacitus. Do we all know the Pantheon? I don't know. Do we all know the Colosseum? Maybe. Maybe we don't all know Tacitus, but we all know who the Roman emperors were because and we know them through the history that Roman historians left for us.
But with Tacitus, we're getting a perspective of an individual as he attempts to distill elements of what he finds of interest, but also consequential within history.
Yeah.
Whereas is not the architect attempting to relay something of a more communal or pluralistic mode of or mode of expression? In other words, when if something like even when Haussmann in Paris is going through the plan of Paris, and he what I think it was the genius in it was not just the constant concern about the functionality of it, but
Yeah.
certainly the aesthetic, and of course the concerns about communal health and having green spaces and the like, and residential neighborhoods dating back to the Middle Ages be damned if that's what's needed. It's a reflection too that he was concerned about that this ought to be a greater, again, I coming short of a word or a different word than expression, but I suppose projection of the city's culture and the people.
Yeah, perhaps we mean that he was engaging the public in a way that
Right.
addressed the whole public.
Mhm.
And yet I would say that just to be concerned with history and how history unfolds is to address the public and to that's quite a public enterprise in its way. And then I would also flip that, and when you were talking about Tacitus and what he did, and one individual choosing to emphasize one thing or another according to his priorities to show something, that just sounds like an artist at work to me, you know. And architects do that also, and so do poets, and so do composers of music or writers of fiction, or painters or sculptors. It is it's what the artistic enterprise is, or the creative enterprise is.
Yeah, Charlie, isn't this fun where I'm trying to throw roses and flowers at architecture as the historian, and Sam's
Yeah,
throwing
this is cute right here. This is cute. What's going on?
throwing lauds and roses at the
All the other arts.
No,
and all the other arts. Yeah.
no, you're more important.
one
You're-
one of my favorite quotations by he was a designer of all types. He lived in New York, and he was a classical designer in a time when that was not really done. So probably the height of modernism. His name was, I think, Pierce Rice. I know of but one art was his motto, meaning I think that all the arts do the same thing. They're charged with the same brief, right? And so architecture is one means of approaching that brief, right? And it has things that are particular to it that the others don't have, right?
Yeah.
But especially as I get older, I think of them all in relationship to one another. And I think of something as large as the culture as necessarily comprising all the different ways we make and improve and ornament reality.
Very good. And do so within the natural supply God has graced us with.
Yes, I think ultimately we're singing hymns of praise is
Yes.
what we're doing. Yeah.
Right. If St. Augustine said singing is praying twice, what would a building be? How many times would we be praying?
Oh, it would just be just another version of that same thing.
Excellent.
In the end, one thing I noticed as an architect is that the design is one part of the implementation of the building, and a contractor will say, "Oh, that's my building," right? And a plumber will say, "I plumb that building. That's my building." And to them, the architect is not the central figure. Rather, to each of us who participate in it, we are ourselves the central figure, right? But the architect makes the design that guides the implementation, but in the end, the building is the fact, right?
Yeah.
Not the piece of paper that the building was drawn on. And so the building is a more complex enterprise than an architect's design. It's more like a movie being made, and you could call the architect the director, maybe, right? But a building itself is beyond the architect.
And it's wonderful too that if the architect is the director of that building, until the cornerstone is destroyed and removed, in many ways, the history and the story of that building is yet to play out because what, of course, could happen there, what transpires there, who was giving a lecture there, or in other words, the even going back to the World's Fair in 1893. I mean, of course, I'm a little bit biased, but it still amazes me that Frederick Jackson Turner disclosed and promoted his frontier thesis right there at the fair.
Yeah.
And though those buildings be gone, that remains. It's astounding that architecture and that type of mode of expression can have a history and a story that lives on beyond even again. I said that the limitation was when the corner store was removed, but that's not true either because there are so many buildings that were around in Daniel Burnham's time that still have a history
Yes, yes.
that are no longer
Yes.
here with us.
Right, right. It's a setting. It's a setting for things to happen. It's a setting for real life to happen.
Mm-hmm.
And probably doesn't gain its full meaning until the real life is happening in it. Of course not. Yeah.
Yeah.
Of course that's when it's most meaningful.
And your point's well taken, Sam, too, because of course, as you go and look at a Van Gogh in the Musée d'Orsay or something like that, or even in our own Art Institute Chicago, the paintings and the reflections of the people and their impressions of that work of art are still resonant with what someone might have about stepping into a structure and whatever they're going to do there, and then their experience and how they either as a community or just as an individual they're impacted by that, and they might not even know or be cognizant of it.
Yeah.
That's the beauty of it.
Museums, of course, are particularly interesting because they're populated with beautiful objects and artifacts,
Mm-hmm.
right? So there's a whole other kind of life going on there, right? Than people using it, because in a way the population of those buildings is the artifacts, right?
Yeah. So let's get back into the nitty-gritty about the 1909 plan. What were the things that were the aspects that were clearly implemented that you say that's wonderful? Conversely, what were the aspects that you just thought were, as you studied it and are a scholar of it, just said, well, that's not really implementable, that's not functional, or was never going to be a part of the future of Chicago? And then finally, it's a sort of three-part question. What aspects of the plan were never taken on and implemented, but it's lamentable that they were not?
Well, I think there's a connection between the unrealistic proposals and the ones that were not implemented.
Okay.
And the great thing that wasn't implemented, can either of you name it? The piece
boy,
of the plan?
what is it? Just the central district flowing from Buckingham Fountain?
Yes, it's the Civic Center.
Right.
And the Civic Center, with a gigantic domed city hall, was to occupy what's now the Circle Interchange.
Mm.
That's where it would be. And it would be surrounded by lower buildings serving, it's basically a consolidated government center. So the state, the federal, and the local government would all be represented there. Now, Chicago is not primarily a government city.
That's what's this. I'm so glad you're talking about this, because this is what, as I was looking through the book, and my political and ideological, both, well, Charlie and my political and ideological dispositions, it seems that a city that was formed and erupted on the scene, in large part because of private enterprise, it's quite the oddity to see Burnham then put governmental bureaucratic institutions at its heart.
Well, an architect is always looking for a kind of central point of emphasis that will sum up the whole and be the climax, let's say, of the plan.
Okay.
So 200 years before or 300 years before, what would that have been? What kind of building would that have been?
I would say something like a mercantile exchange.
In any city, what was the great
Oh, the
building?
church, the cathedral.
Yes, that would have been a church.
Mm-hmm.
But post Enlightenment, I would say that the high secular buildings took over the role of the church,
Mm-hmm.
and as a building type at the top of the hierarchy.
Yes.
And so, what would represent the city to itself, but the hall of government for the city?
Oh, this is so key, Charlie, because we're talking about painting too, and Sam will know, and I can post it when we have an opportunity, and it'll be on the video. But the famous Monet painting of the Gare Saint-Lazare, where it's a train station in Paris, and this has been interpreted as you see the plumes of smoke coming from the trains, and there's a cathedral glass steel structure that goes over the train station.
Yeah.
It's just the replacement for the church. It's just the replacement of the cathedral. And what's flowing in is sort of the sacred of the modern, namely transportation, modern business, and government all colluding and coming together to push, sort of almost wrench society away from its medieval past. So it's truly enlightenment. If I always think that if Monet, well, if Rousseau was a painter, or if Voltaire was a painter, he would have been Monet painting that.
Hmm. I wonder. I wonder, is that what Monet, is that the reading he intended? I don't know.
I believe it was, but I could take a look further about that. But I was always, whenever I was in an art history class, there it is. Yeah.
Uh-huh.
So Charlie's bringing it up now.
Well,
Yes,
your
and
modernist teachers would have no doubt told you that that is the new cathedral, but I don't know if he would have said
right. Yeah, and I'm not sure, and maybe it's even more profound if he was not absolutely cognizant of it, that it was just that this was the spirit of his age as he just wished to portray it, and the dominance of this train station. And you could see by the way, you could see the buildings of Haussmann's plan in the back
Yeah.
of that. So, and then the train roaring through. So, and then of course,
Why wouldn't a painter be interested in that as a subject for his own reasons? He's very interested in study of light, which I'm sure this would be a good environment or a good sort of laboratory to study. Again, I don't know, but I've just become, so often things get recast as something that they may not have been originally. And we might remember that by people with an agenda to ply.
That's true. And frankly, it's kind of simplistic to see the steam coming from the smokestack as the same thing that would come from an incense vessel within the church. So I'm sure we don't want to be victims of the simplistic liaison.
Sounds like possible Marxist romanticism to me, or sentimental reading of something.
Sure.
Maybe.
Sure.
I don't know.
It could be. It could be. So go on with the
So I
implemented.
think the Hall of Government was a natural. It was a natural thing for Burnham to emphasize against all evidence, and I think what they thought. I think we might try to go back to that period, 1909. So it's 20 years after after Chicago's become the second largest city. How did the plan of Chicago itself come to be patronized and made? Basically, after the World's Columbian Exposition, Burnham went on to do other real urban plans, including the Macmillan Plan for beautifying Washington, D.C., which is largely responsible for why it looks the way it does now.
And Manila, correct?
Yes, Manila, San Francisco. Probably the best implemented one was in Washington, because that's where the federal government could pay for the improvements, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the leading citizens of Chicago, Chicago, it's like in a way what I imagine medieval or Renaissance Florence was, where you had this kind of group of commercial aristocrats in healthy competition working toward a larger purpose.
Mm.
And I think they didn't know where that would lead, and they had high hopes that it would lead to somewhere very great. And they hired Burnham to basically give them that vision of what they might make. And maybe I'm reading into what they wanted, and I'm substituting what he wanted or envisioned for what they commissioned him to do. But the real model was Paris.
Yes.
Could it beat Paris? And
Mhm.
probably in the end, the real model was Rome, with the civic center replacing St. Peter's,
Yeah.
right? It's a kind of new St. Peter's.
Hmm.
But the goal was to, I think, realize a European city on a whole new scale, on an American scale, and outdo the precedents.
Mm.
So to the extent that that vision coincided with reality, it was implemented. Where it didn't, it wasn't. So there was no, I can't imagine that all of those commercial aristocrats would want to help pay for a giant city hall bigger than St. Peter's. I think priorities.
Yes. I don't, in all the commentary from the Marshall Fields of the world to the Potter Palmers of the world, I'd never recall, and I could be mistaken here, them talking about how local government and authorities ought to be the tip of the spear in
Yeah.
leading Chicago to its grand destiny. They saw themselves as commercial entrepreneurs and builders and those who are engaged in enterprise as and their antecedents as the reason for Chicago's existence and future, let's call it perhaps dominance on the stage.
Right.
Yeah. I know let me turn to Charlie because I have another series of questions that are going to lead us to our most famous segment. So go ahead, Charlie. You go ahead and quiz Sam here a little bit.
Chicago, New York comparisons.
You know, my thesis advisor in college, he was from Yugoslavia, but he had done his undergrad, or maybe his early graduate studies at Urbana, at Champaign-Urbana, in art history. And so and I think I was talking to him about this book when I was preparing it, and we were talking about Chicago, and he said to me something like, for a while there really was this, they really didn't know who would win.
Mhm.
And they really thought that Chicago might replace New York as the prime city of the continental country from the middle of the country. I think what allowed Chicago to preserve its personality for so long, until very recent time, maybe it's still there a little bit, is that it didn't become that city. Because what happened to New York is what happens to every prime city, which is that it becomes a clearinghouse or a treasure house for all of the best things from everywhere else, and has no style of its own.
Like a museum.
Yeah. And Chicago, and that did not completely happen to New York. There was a style here. But Chicago retained its personality for longer, I think, than New York did. And so, what do you want? Do you want a city where I routinely see in Chicago, I remember it from there, and Charlie, we were just talking about it. I find that Chicagoans love Chicago, and they all, and so many of them know very much about it. And I think probably a higher percentage than is found in other cities, perhaps. I don't think you have that in New York. I don't think you have that same it's not just loyalty, it's love of, it's interest in. I think Tom Beebe, for example, thought of himself as a Chicago architect, working in Chicago on themes which were particular they may have had universal application, but they were particular to Chicago, and the way they were worked out was particular to Chicago. When I think of his counterpart in New York, no kind of specific thought like that, no thesis like that.
Hmm. Is that because Chicago had so many architects who were focused on retaining the character of the city? I mean,
I don't know why it is. I don't know
mhm,
why, what is Chicago's character? It's kind of like straightforward, rational.
mm,
And it might be enriched, but that's a secondary characteristic. So I used to think Detroit has these exuberant 20s skyscrapers.
yes,
It feels like it's their most exuberant incarnation, probably, and you would not see them in Chicago. Probably Carbide and Carbon is like the closest that you would get in Chicago. Board of Trade is very much a Chicago Art Deco. That's one of the best
right.
also. Art Deco skyscraper. It's staid, it's solemn, it is straightforward. It has limited ornament, but very well done and very competent and effectively done. The statue at the top is
The
a good one.
series, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's a nod to the classical Charlie. So at there's a statue of the goddess of grain, fitting because grain was the grain hub of the country, really, and indeed of the world. In fact, if I recall correctly, it was by around 1880, so this is quite early,
Yeah.
that Chicago surpassed our Arkhangelsk, which is in northern Russia, as the grain exporting port of the entire world.
Yeah.
So more grain was getting pushed out to the rest of the world through Chicago, this little stinky place of onion and garlic 30 years before that no one really wanted to invest in, all of a sudden is becoming in many ways the food provider to the globe on a scale that was probably never foreseen in the eras previous in eras past. Uh, so let's talk about then, Sam, where Chicago is now. And I was just reading a piece today about how, and it was from the point of view of someone who is saddened by the fact that many of these great structures, particularly in the financial district, but in other areas downtown, are because of the lack of demand, the paucity of demand for commercial space, for other what we might call enterprise functions, are now being converted to residential centers, or at least a significant portion of the buildings are being converted to residential centers. Is this something that's to be lamented, or is it? What do you think?
Well, one thing about buildings in general, architecture, is that they have to serve a purpose. They're not just giant pieces of sculpture sitting there.
Mhm.
So when they lose their purpose is when they're most in danger of being destroyed. So anything that isn't destruction, I think, is better than destruction. So I think probably the LaSalle Street corridor is pretty empty. And I
Mhm.
think a lot of that office space is maybe in the West Loop now, right?
Mhm.
It's so interesting how things keep moving. Um, but those are some of the finest buildings. The Civic Opera House is probably my single favorite building.
Is it?
Yeah, now that it's popping in my mind. Yes, absolutely. I love the way it goes straight down into the river on the
Mhm.
back. It just has a very grand, uh, fantastical
It
river.
reminds me of it reminds me of that it's almost as if it's a citadel, but a
Yeah,
citadel for art.
yeah,
It's very reminiscent of the Castel Sant'Angelo in Rome, right
yes,
along the Tiber.
yes,
Not in red stone, but in gray.
yes,
Um, yeah, that is a beautiful building.
yes.
So,
So I don't think it has to be a bad thing that they're being turned into apartment buildings.
okay.
The most important thing is that they be used and that remain, a vital part of the city. And probably, what happened there used to be something called metropolitan zoning that all American cities pretty much followed. And what it meant was that you had a commercial center, a residential periphery, and then you had industry all by itself in another part of the periphery. So in Chicago, that's on this to the south, right?
And west.
Yeah, and west. That's right. Wherever there were basically water channels, right?
Yes.
They could have easy access to, and where space was cheap. So that's why industry gets put on the periphery. But with the sort of decline of industry and probably the physical spread of the city, you eventually have a kind of breakdown of metropolitan zoning where people work on the periphery as well as live there, and they live in the center as well as work there. And so basically where you live in the city becomes a kind of lifestyle choice about what you want. You know, do you want a yard or do you want to be in an urban environment? And I don't think that's a bad thing, because what happens with metropolitan zoning is that the constant traffic from one part of the city to another twice a day eventually clogs the arteries of circulation, and there's a limit on how big the city can be.
Sure.
Now, we sort of have I feel like there's traffic all the time now, right? That people are moving all over the city all the time. So maybe we haven't exchanged metropolitan zoning for something that's better. That was sort of at the heart of our new plan, of our proposed plan, was to Chicago has something that no other American city really does, which is it has bundled transportation. So between the lanes of the expressways, you have the L running, and then at least out on the periphery, and then over alongside it, you have the metro running. So there are multiple modes of transportation along those lines of circulation. And so we aimed to rebuild along those lines of circulation so that you could redistribute traffic off of the expressway. Because if you could entice people to live along the L, then more people could take the L in. Or you could build new metro stops, you know, somewhere out in the urban fabric, and more people would use those. Right? So solving the transportation problem is the key to any urban plan for a big American city, because they're so sprawling.
And what do you think about?
Sorry, excuse me, just
No,
one second. What we really need the expressways for is intermodal freight transit, right? Because those containers that go from ship to truck to train, you know, we need those to be able to move efficiently through the city. So it's in everyone's interest to get cars, redistribute them off of the expressways, right? So that can happen.
Right. And as northern and northwest Indiana and even southwest Michigan continue to develop, the traffic problems on 94 are atrocious, especially as you see all the trucks just piling up. It is, right. It's a clogged artery. It's bad cholesterol there.
That's right.
Yeah. So final thing on this before we launch into Meanwhile Park, we're all going to have a good laugh together. And Charlie's assured us that there's excellent material this week. What do you think about the Bears Stadium being located in the lakefront and the museum campus as it's proposed right now?
I have to say, you mentioned it to me and I didn't look. I don't know what it looks like.
It's very modernistic.
Yeah. And is it to replace? Will they replace Soldier Field completely?
I'm not sure.
Is it in the same place or is it next to it?
I think it's next to it.
Okay, fine. You know, we're in a stage in all of the cities where plans that were never finished are now being actively undermined. And that's just where we are. So for whatever reason, I mean, they would say, well, we want to have a sports complex just like we have a museum complex, and we want them all there. Not sure that's the best planning idea, but why can't that thing look like the other things that are there? Well, the Soldier Field doesn't even look like itself anymore. Although that's another case where at least the building isn't destroyed. That's probably the best. Oh, I see.
So there it is, Sam.
Yeah, and where is Soldier Field
It was,
here?
I think Soldier
Oh,
Field
beyond, I
just
see
used to
it.
be the south there.
Yeah, it'll just be another hulking.
Oh,
It
I'm
reminds
sorry. Wait,
me.
you could see Soldier Field
Yeah,
actually the
just beyond
columns
it.
just to the north. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. It reminds me of the convention center, which is just another big object sitting out on the lakefront. Although that one, there's something elegant about the convention center and not really about this. And this is on a bigger scale. Yeah, I wish it wasn't there. It's not the right place for it.
It's oddly it's almost as it seemed almost like a tumor for some reason. It's just bulbous and not in the right place.
I think the main thing is that it's spoiling the lakefront, and that's
Yes.
not necessary or desired for
No.
I don't think many people. I don't see how that's going to improve the experience of Chicago's really great natural asset for many people.
Yes, which is the lake.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thanks, Sam, on all that. It was such wonderful insight on all of this. And I would encourage anyone who has a real curiosity about this to pick up your book, which is really meticulous and informative about all the plans and all the subjects we really touched upon in brief tonight. So, Charlie, are we just about ready to fire it up?
We're ready.
Okay, here's the people segment.
Meanwhile in Oak Park.
Meanwhile, in Oak Park.
Now, Sam, you have to promise not to hold back here. If you hear something ridiculous, please laugh out loud with all the joviality and condescension that a story merits.
We've got 3 stories. The first one, League of Women Voters gears up for election season. Combating disinformation and voter suppression are among the priorities for November. Preparation for the 2024 presidential election is underway on the local level for the League of Women Voters of Oak Park River Forest. Gary, you ever been to one of those meetings?
Oh, all the time. I'm a regular.
The league is actively curating a panel of experts for its fall 2024 kickoff event, which will discuss the fight against spreading misinformation and disinformation.
Which interestingly enough is actually in the charter for the existence of the League of Women Voters to spread misinformation and disinformation. They're changing their whole raison d'etre here.
Jane Hastings, president of the Oak Park River Forest League of Women Voters, said that the event is open to the public and will highlight the significance of the proliferation of misinformation and disinformation and its impact on democratic processes.
Sam, can you already tell the writing is profound and beautiful, and it's straight out of LexisNexis for Oak Park or for the Wednesday Journal. Let's see how many words ending in ION we could put in one sentence.
Quote, starting to get involved in fighting some of the disinformation and misinformation, I think, is a huge step for our organizations, Hastings said. It's satisfying to work with allies on promoting the fundamentals of democracy. This is where it gets
Charlie,
good.
wait. We all know what democracy means here, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
The League of Women Voters of Illinois formed the Mis/Disinformation Task Force in January 2024 with the objective of educating the public on the topic. The task force has been providing support to the Oak Park River Forest League as they prepare for the fall kickoff event, Hastings said. In addition, the league has organized meetings in the past, such as candidate forums, which includes individuals running for local political offices, school boards, village boards, library boards, and more. The forums are organized by the league, which is a nonpartisan organization. And we know what that means, and allow for candidates to introduce the messages of their platform and answer questions from attendees.
It's a nonpartisan organization in the urban locale in which only one party exists.
Quote, the candidate forums were about not necessarily persuading anybody to change their minds, but to see each other as valid humans with good points and will hear you and acknowledge you, Hastings said. Political discourse is really healthy for democracy.
In this very narrow channel.
The league serves 3 neighborhoods of Oak Park, River Forest, and Forest Park, improving the accessibility for residents to become engaged with local politics and having their voice heard in these candidate forums is very important to the league. Tina Birnbaum, co-vice president of the league, said that the candidate forums are recorded on Zoom, so residents can access the recordings at their convenience. Throughout 1 year, the viewership increased dramatically for these recordings, which was approximately 3,500 online visitors.
As there was a pandemic of not being able to go to sleep. So that put them all to sleep.
The recordings allow for people to be introduced to the personalities of the candidates and hear their platforms in an authentic way, Birnbaum said. Quote, it's one thing to read it, Birnbaum said. It's another thing to see and hear the actual candidate talking about that issue. The candidate forums are one of the various initiatives organized by the league that ties back to one of the main objectives of the organization, which is voter education. Quote, part of the commitment to the women's vote was making sure they had good, nonpartisan, factual information to make their decisions, Hastings said. That is very much a historical tenet of the league.
That's a tenet spelled wrong, but go ahead.
The National League of Women Voters was founded as a successor to the National American Women's Suffrage Association in Chicago in 1920. Under the leadership of suffragist Carrie Chapman Catt, it was formed by the leading suffragists that secured the right to vote for women in the United States. 4 years after the 19th Amendment was ratified, the Oak Park River Forest League of Women Voters was established. Since then, the league has helped residents overcome any restrictions or barriers to voting. Like what? The drive there? Quote, we really try to encourage people to vote, Birnbaum said. We're all about getting people involved in government. That's a huge issue for us. The league is about advocating for empowering voters and defending our democracy. And lately, there's been a lot to do in those 2 areas. The Oak Park River Forest League of Women Voters collaborated with leagues across the state of Illinois to produce the Illinois Voter Guide, which provides residents with information on where, how, and when they can vote for public officials. The league also hopes to serve as an example for other states in the country that do not make voting education resources accessible, Birnbaum said. All right, we're getting close then. Quote, Illinois does well in letting people vote. We're a part of the National League, and there's other states where it's difficult for people to vote. Here we go, Gary. Birnbaum said, polling places have been eliminated, barriers to voting have been erected. Okay, so it's always, we do a good job here, but
yes,
there's other states where it's very difficult for people to vote.
It's all those knuckle dragging racists in Georgia where Sam's from that don't allow all the black people to vote still, as if it's, 1955.
Quote, polling places have been eliminated, barriers to voting have been erected. When Hastings considered the motivations for the league's effort, her answer was clear and simple. Everybody's vote should count, Hastings said.
Especially the dead here in Chicago
Yeah.
and in Wayne County, Michigan, and in Fulton County, Georgia. All right, Sam, what do you think?
I guess I'd like to see terms defined. Misinformation and disinformation. How are they different? What do they mean?
You're asking already way too much for the Wednesday Journal. Sam Roche.
So is the Wednesday Journal it's the local paper for Oak Park?
Yeah, it's the communist arm.
Yeah.
Got it.
Yeah. If they were being more honest about their stripes, they'd have the hammer and sickle behind the Wednesday Journal.
And is Oak Park the most
progressive?
Is it typical of other suburban neighborhoods, or is it particular? Is it especially extreme?
I would say, yeah, Oak Park and Evanston. So Oak Park is the representative on the western side, west side, and then Evanston on the north. I don't know if there's a comparable south side suburb. I don't think so.
Hyde
they
Park,
try to really outduel themselves in the level of woke progressivism.
right?
So as to
Right.
why that occurred, I mean, that's an interesting subject in and of itself. I think it actually has to do with the original settlement of Oak Park being mainly congregationalists. It has a very puritanical spirit to it, and that's just been metamorphosed into progressivism.
Right. Yes,
Second,
evangelization is definitely going on in this
Yes, and you
League
can
of Women
tell
Voters.
too how they're very much bifurcating it's always the us versus them.
Yeah.
We, the educated and elevated, the enlightened, and then the savages on the inside. And then there's, of course, worry, consternation, and constant anxiety if any savage should actually enter into Oak Park, what to do about them
Yeah.
while being welcoming, or at least the optics need to be there.
Yeah, I do wonder, our plan basically, we took one of the interstates and proposed how it might be improved according to the tenets of the plan. And the one we took was the Eisenhower Expressway.
Oof.
So
Please,
we looked at it from downtown to Oak Park,
Mhm.
basically. And I wonder if the fact that Oak Park, is it Austin that's right before Oak Park?
Yes,
And Austin is not nice, right?
correct. It once was. It
Right.
was once gorgeous, and there are great, actual, very beautiful buildings in Austin, and the residences are quite nice.
That's
But
where
now it's
Columbus Park
dilapidated.
is also.
yep.
Mhm.
But I wonder if it doesn't have something to do with its being, on its doorstep is something not nice. That tends to maybe that makes things more extreme, or makes identities more extreme.
Mm-hmm. Sure. The civilized versus the barbarians, but we can't call them barbarians.
Right.
Yeah. All right, Charlie, next story.
Second story. Some Oak Parkers are still pushing for a ceasefire resolution. Other residents are strongly opposed to the proposed resolution.
So, Sam, when we're talking about a moderately sized to larger sized suburb of Chicago, talking about whether it's the war in Ukraine and Russia or the war in the Middle East between Hamas ostensibly and Israel, what do you get a sense of right away that sort of really causes more than just nausea in Charlie and I and discomfort, intestinal discomfort when we read stuff like this? I mean, isn't it absurd that these people think that whatever they're doing is going to have a global impact?
Maybe it's part of the identity of the town that it thinks it has something to say, or maybe this is just the town representing itself to itself.
Yep. Oh, well, yes, that's a good point. I never considered
It
that.
does a lot of that.
It's more the mirror.
Right. And there's
than-
just a lot of that. Exactly. Yeah.
Yes. Okay.
At Tuesday night's Oak Park Village board meeting, some residents once again urged trustees to sign off on a proposed permanent ceasefire resolution related to the Israel-Hamas war. Those requests came during non-agenda public comment. As the topic is still not on the village board agenda, that means trustees cannot act by voting. Doing so could violate the Illinois Open Meetings Act. But as of June 6th, 1,070 individuals have signed a petition hosted by Karen Van Slyke, founder and chair of the Committee for a Just Peace in Palestine/Israel, calling for approval of the resolution. The first time community members and individuals from CJPIP spoke to the board publicly about the resolution was at the April 9th meeting, which erupted in anger. At the May 1st meeting, some community members came back to push for it again, and now they're trying again. But while some residents spoke in support of a ceasefire resolution, many others commended trustees for refusing to entertain it and staying out of foreign affairs. Village President Vicky Skaman has continuously thanked residents for sharing their thoughts, but the board has not taken any further public action.
The conversation goes on.
On Tuesday, more residents spoke against the ceasefire resolution than in favor of it, a change from previous meetings. One
The
community
Zionists are agitated. The Zionists are agitated.
One community member in favor of a ceasefire resolution, Jenna Leving Jacobson, said maintaining the status quo is doing harm to marginalized communities. She said it appears trustees are afraid to pass a resolution and offend some members of the Jewish community. But others deserve the same level of consideration, she said. Quote, "Who gets to feel safe in our community?" Jacobson asked. Whose safety is prioritized and whose safety gets compromised for the illusion of security for others?
This is so hedonistic. Think about that. They're not even concerned about the children dying in Gaza. Right? It's all about who feels safe in Oak Park versus who doesn't feel safe in Oak Park.
Another resident, Yoko Toretta, read a letter signed by several community members in which she said she feels a moral obligation to speak out against violence and human rights violations. The countless loss of lives during the humanitarian crisis in Gaza is devastating, she said, and demands immediate action.
Well, at least Yoko's got her priorities straight a little bit.
Demands immediate action from the village of Oak Park. Like let's
I get that.
let's pump
but
the
at least
brakes.
At least she's
Well,
thinking about the humanitarian crisis in Gaza instead of the humanitarian crisis that's made up in Oak Park.
quote, while a resolution from Oak Park alone cannot bring an end to this conflict, by joining 171 other municipalities in passing this measure, we can send a powerful message to our federal elected officials, Toretta said. But many others expressed opposition to the proposed resolution. Daniel Kurzane, an associate rabbi at Oak Park Temple, said while he wants the war to end, he doesn't think the village's trustees should get involved. Brian Sklar, an Oak Park resident, said when people say free Palestine, they're disregarding the one Jewish majority country. When you say from the river to the sea, you're talking about genocide, Sklar said. From the river to the sea has become a slogan calling for freedom from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, used by pro-Palestinian demonstrators and at pro-Palestinian rallies, according to Al Jazeera. Many audience members, however, interjected to express disagreement at his statement. Phyllis Rubin, who said she's a member of Oak Park Temple, said she wants trustees to understand both sides. She said she doesn't think the proposed resolution and its supporters call loudly for the dismantling of Hamas a priority to her. Quote, arrogant are those who cry only ceasefire, Rubin said. It's so easy to say war is bad, so ceasefire must be good. A simple choice, right? No, it's absolutely not so simple, especially in the Middle East.
No arrogance there.
Diane Gordon, who said she's Jewish, said the trustees weighing in on foreign policy would make, quote, no difference, but could offend community members. No suburb with a significant Jewish population has passed the ceasefire resolution, she said.
Oh, there's a shocker.
Quote, my heart breaks every day about what's happening in Gaza, another resident said. However, this is the most complicated geopolitical conundrum in modern human history. I don't want you spending your time on thinking about the complexity of this issue.
Oh my gosh. All right, Sam, any thoughts there?
Again, a town. I don't know. I find quite interesting how in this teacup is a larger. I mean, I feel like any article about this subject in any venue will look just like this, right?
It's true.
So, I guess I find it kind of interesting that it's this little town talking to itself about these things.
Yeah. It's almost Mayberry-ish, you know?
Yeah.
It's as if they're all getting together and they're saying there's some persistent and wild thing that's going out far, far away going on, and then we have to somehow have a say in it. And just by us hammering it out and talking among each other, we're going to find out something more profound about ourselves and certainly about what a possible resolution is. But they just always end up spinning their wheels. I know, Sam, I know we're getting pretty late. Do we have another one, Charlie?
We got one more. It's
Do
quick.
you mind sticking around for the last one?
I don't mind.
All right, thanks, Sam.
How to change your gender on Illinois state IDs. A new law.
Easy. Just scratch out what you had on there and put it in put it permanent marker.
A new law permitting this went into effect in April. What does that mean for non-binary residents? As of April 1, Illinois residents now have 3 gender options: M, F, and gender neutral X
Or Twitter.
on driver's licenses and state identification documents. By doing this, Illinois joins 21 other states with similar policies. A 2019 law allowed gender neutral markers on Illinois IDs, but it wasn't until this spring that residents had the opportunity to select the gender neutral option for IDs because the Secretary of State's office needed to update its card issuance system. Shortly after the new policy came into effect, Christopher Jensen, board member of LAGBAC, Chicago's LGBTQ plus bar association, went to the DMV to change their ID. Jensen uses he and they pronouns and was the first openly non-binary member on the board. Quote, I was excited, they said. I wanted it so badly. I was just really excited to have it, for it to accurately reflect who I am. It's a really powerful affirmation from the state, and it takes a step towards taking away that erasure, giving people their identities back, hearing their voices.
Whoa, look at that atatism there. He had no affirmation of his identity until the state validated it for him.
Yeah, I've never heard anyone so fired up about going to the DMV.
Yeah. It reminds me of Justin Raimondi's famous the openly gay libertarian before he died, about his constant opposition to a gay marriage legalization, because he said if you're gay, you don't need the state to qualify or validate your sexuality or orientation. But man, that in and of itself is the cult and religion here.
The National Center for Transgender Equality's 2022 U.S. Trans Survey Early Insights Report. Oh my goodness, that is a full line of text, and that's just said nothing. The National Center for Transgender Equality's 2022 U.S. Trans Survey Early Insights Report showed that 22% of respondents had been, quote, verbally harassed, assaulted, asked to leave a location, or denied services after showing an ID with a name or gender that did not correspond with their presentation.
That's not a high percentage.
No.
Yeah,
That's pretty low. 22%.
Yeah.
Respondents. So who's responding? And that seems like people willing to try.
Yeah. And what are the venues by which you are going to be denied service because you
yeah. Is it
present?
like an underage bar?
Right. What would an underage bar look like?
Well, how much of that is just someone that's not 21 trying to go into a bar? Like that's the number one reason why people would turn you away from service for showing an ID. But like there's no explanation on what
Right, but
those
as it
services
pertains,
are.
sure, but as it pertains to gender, what are the venues where you show on your card it says M for male, and because you have an M, even though you identify as an X, you're denied access?
Yeah, I don't know.
Are those just gyms, restrooms, gender specific? I don't know what those would be.
I don't know. Gender incongruent identification can result in denial of employment, housing, and benefits, and bring harassment and violence, according to the NCTE's 2015 National Transgender Discrimination Survey.
Okay, but notice it's a survey. That's not a scientific study. It's just what people say.
And it's from 2015, which is
right. But again, it's just based on the perceived experience of the individuals impacted. I don't know. Go ahead.
Accurate and consistent identification is necessary to open bank accounts, starting jobs, enrolling in school, and traveling. For transgender and non-binary individuals, affirmation of gender and pronouns can also be life-saving and vital in suicide prevention.
Holy cow.
Yeah, that's a pretty dark sentence to
Yeah.
read out loud. I'm going to say that again. For transgender and non-binary individuals, affirmation of gender and pronouns can also be life-saving and vital in suicide prevention. According to the Trevor Project, respecting gender identity among young transgender and non-binary people is consistently associated with lower attempts of attempted suicide.
Okay.
Quote, for people who are getting it, it's a peace of mind, said Jensen. There is a comfort in knowing that the state acknowledges that we aren't male or female, and that's okay.
But the state is not God. We are God is not the state, and state's not God. We promise.
Jensen also said that having documentation of non-binary residents in Illinois could help to create new programs for non-binary and transgender residents. Quote, I think if they notice that there is a significant enough amount of the population, then they could say this is a community that needs to be addressed, they said. However, some people are hesitant to identify as non-binary on IDs. The trans community experiences high levels of violence, especially transgender people of color and Black transgender women. Okay, especially transgender people of color and Black transgender women. According to the 2015 U.S. Transgender Survey Illinois State Report, 69% of respondents who interacted with police or other law enforcement who knew they were transgender reported experiencing mistreatment. Especially for those with additional identities targeted by police violence, the X marker as an automatic signifier of a trans identity brings some concerns. Quote, I've talked to a lot of people about this, and a lot of them are concerned about the fact that it is going to be a signal immediately to a police officer that they're trans, Jensen said. Just by handing over their ID. Same for TSA security, bars checking IDs. I think there's some personal safety concerns that people have about sharing that information with everyone they encounter. Okay, so do you want it or not?
Yeah. I mean,
Do you want the X or no?
heck, I love that it said X.
Some people have advocated for an elimination of gender altogether on identification documents. Quote, while including a gender neutral option on identity documents is a step in the right direction, it would be better to eliminate gender from IDs altogether. It's not relevant anymore since the photo ID became prominent. Stephanie Skora, executive director of Brave Space Alliance, a Black and trans-led LGBTQ center on the South Side, told the Chicago Sun-Times in 2019. For people who do choose to change the gender on their ID, the non-binary option can bring security, comfort, and affirmation. Quote, the most important thing is for affirmation of individual people's gender identity, said Jensen. For me, having a state ID that says accurately what my gender is, rather than being forced to pick between one of two things that don't apply, there's a psychological benefit to that for individuals. To ensure that this new policy is positive, regular trainings could be essential. Quote, anybody that interacts with the public as a government official should have some kind of training on how to have a respectful conversation with people that you may not understand or even agree with, Jensen said. Quote, it's still none of your business. You still have to treat them with as much respect as you do anyone else.
All right, Mr. Jensen, I'm Officer Johnson. Are you packing heat or not? I was just asking about a gun. Do you have a gun in the car?
Since April 2022, United States citizens also have been able to choose the non-binary X gender on passports. The government has resources for non-binary international travelers, and they did the link, but they didn't hyperlink it. You're going to love this, Gary. Hold on. Illinois residents wanting to change their gender can go to the DMV and complete a gender designation change form. The fee for a new driver's license is $5 and a new state ID card is $10. Planned Parenthood has a comprehensive guide on how to change gender and name markers in Illinois. Here's the link to Planned Parenthood.
Okay, we just found the two links of hyperlinks that in the history of their existence I will never hit. I love I love how again it's the idea that this is all organic, that this is all from grassroots activism concerned about potential suicides. Of course, none of that is historically nor in any way, shape, or form true, but we'll just continue on with the ruse. Sam.
I think the Oak Park Journal makes probably a good forum for passing off things as organic that might not be.
That's the best line ever. That is the best characterization of the Oak Park Journal as ever. Oh my God. That's brilliant. I love it. Well, thanks for joining us.
Hold on. That's a segment.
Oh yeah, that's the segment.
Meanwhile in Oak Park.
Okay.
Thanks, Sam. It was a lot of fun. Gary, what was your favorite part?
Oh, just picking Sam's brain about the Chicago Plan, all the stuff from the era of history that I most love studying, and that is the Gilded Age, early progressive era in the United States. But the way in which I mean, these great metropolitan centers, that there was so much concern and coordination about how to make life great within them, and the genius in the designs, but also I would call it the kind of altruistic nature of a feeling of true civil and civic pride that ought to be made manifest in everything from its buildings to its restaurants to its culture, language, institutions. I think that's what's so profound about the era. How about you, Charlie? What was the best part of the show?
Just feeling robbed. We've been robbed. I feel it every week.
Robbed, how so?
Anytime we think about history and talking about any era we talk about rapid growth, and I loved how he broke down the competition within Chicago to attract even our government officials. Back then were entrepreneurial, and he talked about speculation as well, and that's a very entrepreneur. Just the idea of something like that happening at City Hall today is so foreign to us.
Instead of the plunder,
us 21st century, that it's not just that it's something besides the Chicago Teachers Union just raping the city. That it's anything besides that is it makes you feel robbed. But I did enjoy learning about it even more.
Things were really bad before they could be consolidated into improvements. They had to get really bad before there could be change. Because I think what made big plans happen in our history was the real fear that if they didn't do something, it would all just fall apart. So maybe we'll come back to that period. Although I worry that we don't have a strong shared culture to do that with. So we don't have the classical discipline anymore. It's a niche subject rather than something that most people do admire and recognize it, and would like to see things built in that style. But it's artificially kept from flourishing. So I don't know that we have the tools to consolidate as we did then. I don't know if we have the cultural tools. I don't think our architects are trained nearly as well as those who did the World's Columbian Exposition and then the various plans. We just don't have that level of competency in not just this discipline, but a lot of them. So that's a problem.
Well,
but
if that cultural solidification and reawakening ever takes place, we know a few architects, and one in particular that we can call on.
Yes,
we have to relocate again.
Yeah.
Well, thanks so much, Sam. This has been a blast.
My pleasure. Thank you both. Thanks for your time.
All right, everyone. Take care.